our conversation on Causeway Conversations. Good
Right. Hi.
morning.
Morning. We'll wait for a while as we usually do. Give it a minute.
Yeah.
Whoever's around and not out shopping or just woken up. But anyway, you can always watch this later, I guess.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the technology. No need to park the car to rush in for this conversation.
And we're just also saying that as we're talking, if you have any questions for our guest today, you can always put it down, and we will get our guest to answer you because she's the one with the intellect. We're just the ones asking the questions. So you can do that in the chat, and we'll get our guest to answer. Right.
Right. Yes. So, 26th July, which was last Tuesday, marked UNESCO's International Day for the Conservation of the Mangrove, and to raise awareness for the importance of these ecosystems. So, they're actually really critical to meeting a number of UN Sustainable Development Goals, as they act as a form of natural coastal defense against rising sea levels, and they also store vast amounts of carbon. Yet, mangroves are disappearing 3 to 5 times faster than overall global forest losses. So that's really got serious ecological and socio-economic impacts. But what is being done to reverse the destruction of these forests?
All right, and we'll get to those answers in a bit. This is Causeway Conversations, where we aim to bridge the sustainability gap. We like that. I'm Freda Liu, together with Rianne Lovell Boland, and today we're both in Kuala Lumpur. She's at her mother's house, and I'm in my
Yeah.
own. And our guest is across the causeway in Singapore. To learn more about mangrove conservation, we're joined by Siti Maryam Yaakub, Head of Projects, Nature-Based and Climate Solutions at DHI Group. And I just want to know what's happening in Singapore, right, as opposed to Malaysia. And DHI is a not-for-profit organization that addresses all challenges in water environments through consultancy services. So, good morning, Dr. Siti.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
How are you guys?
Very good.
Very
And
well, thank
good,
you.
good morning to Ashish and a LinkedIn user. I can't see the name, but anyway. So, Siti, you're a marine ecologist, right? A bit of background on what interested you in entering the field and a bit more about the work you do at DHI Group.
Sure. Good morning to everyone first, and thank you for having me here. It's really exciting to. I've never done this LinkedIn Live thing, so this is
Welcome.
forgive me if there's a bit of swakuness going on. But anyway, so I've always been interested in the sea. I've always liked the sea. I think it's the vastness of it that draws me, as opposed to say forests. I always feel a bit claustrophobic in forests. So yeah, that's where the interest started. I studied marine biology in Australia at James Cook University, and after that, I did my PhD at NUS.
Right.
And following that, there was a short period of time between my bachelor's and my PhD where I worked at the National Parks Board as a marine biodiversity officer. And following my PhD, I joined DHI, where I now head projects in nature based and climate solutions.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, let's now move on to the focus of why we're all here. Why do mangroves matter? Can you actually expand a bit further what role they play in preventing climate change and also protecting the environment?
Sure. So mangroves are really important in the coastal marine environment. They are the interface between land and sea. So they're actually able to, I guess, take the best of both worlds or adapt to the challenges of both worlds. So they tend to grow in these sedimentary, slightly muddy environments, especially around Southeast Asia. And those are areas where they are usually shallow, sheltered coastal waters, very rich in biodiversity. So that's the first point. It's a habitat for many coastal marine species as well as terrestrial species. There are a lot of in Singapore, especially, a lot of endangered or vulnerable species actually live in mangrove systems. There are quite a number of vulnerable mangrove species themselves, in these coastal systems in Singapore. But they're also a very important resource for coastal communities. So beyond Singapore, where there is, I guess, a lot a lot more subsistence fisheries going on.
Right.
It's an important resource for coastal communities because of the fisheries factor. So they're a nursery for a lot of marine species, including species coming from other habitats, other coastal marine habitats such as seagrass and coral reefs. So some of those fish actually spend a part of their lives in mangroves and then migrate over to other habitats once they've reached adult stage. Um, and because they're so important for fish and fisheries, it's actually really an important resource for coastal communities because, as you know, fish protein is probably the most easily accessible, as a protein source, especially in less developed countries. And also, gleaning at low tide is an activity that's taken on by women, so
Mm.
it actually alleviates poverty to some
Mm.
extent when you have mangrove and coastal systems that are rich in biodiversity and are able to support these sorts of activities. Um, Also, where it's hydrodynamically suitable, meaning where the currents and waves are not too active, so
Mm.
low currents, low wave energy. Mangroves are really great for shoreline stabilization. So they have
Right.
these like massive roots that spread out far and wide, and that's able to stabilize the sediment. So it prevents a lot of resuspension, and that improves water clarity. It
Right.
also, yeah, it also allows for the accretion of sediments, and that allows you to build land over time. Actually, so mangroves can actually, I guess, encroach into like the
Right.
sea area over given a long enough time, of course.
Right.
Um, that said, they're not so. A lot of people think that mangroves are good for shoreline protection, but it's really only where the hydrodynamic conditions are suitable. So there have been a lot of cases of mangrove restoration where people have planted where there's a lot of high energy and wave action, and it just results in like massive die off
Nothing.
after the
Right.
planting has occurred. So it's really about where you plant the mangroves and whether they're suited for the environment. But the last and probably most important thing about mangroves is that they're an extremely effective carbon sink. They can mitigate the effects of climate change by absorbing excess carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide, both in the trees as well as in their sediments. And this is the difference between like mangrove forests and other land-based forests. The sediments in the mangroves can store up to 2/3 of the total carbon stock in the ecosystem itself, and it's about 3 to 4 times more effective at sequestering and storing carbon compared to terrestrial systems. So compared to rainforests, for example. So a
Right.
lot of time when you say like, oh, we're planting trees to, um, save the earth, you should
Mm.
really be planting mangrove trees.
Mangroves.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, what you've gone through, I tell you, is I think people are now paying more serious attention
Hmm.
because we've seen climate change. We hear stories in the UK where it's 40 degrees, which is a shock for the Brits, I'm sure.
Yes.
I mean, it's a shock for us, even in this part of the world. That is
True.
extremely hot, right?
Yeah.
And you talk about the whole idea about, I know
Hmm.
your passion is seagrass and how, and mangroves. I guess people only start paying attention when it affects them. And then someone gave me this very interesting story before, and that it's I think to get to the heart of people.
Hmm.
And this guy said if there were no mangroves, this will affect. He said the process is that it will affect flying foxes. Without flying foxes, you don't get your durians, and that was a shock to Malaysians. No durians, and that's why you need your mangroves, right? Anyway, just a couple of
Exactly.
comments. Good morning, Badri from UNITA International University, where I am there sometimes. Sundarban of Bangladesh are the biggest mangrove forest in the world. Okay, and then someone said carbon sponge. I want to know. This is really interesting because I was talking to Riyadh. I said I want to get someone from Singapore because how much mangrove forest is there in Singapore actually? Because I can't imagine it.
Yes, that's a
It's just
very
a
good
tiny
question,
island.
Frida. It is a tiny island, as you mentioned, only 40 kilometers across. But within that 40 kilometers, we actually have a wetland reserve at
Right,
Sungai Buloh, which is in the northwest,
right,
um, near Tuas, or kind of in between Tuas and Woodlands. So if you're
right.
entering Malaysia from either side, it's somewhere in between. Um, in that area, there is actually a wetland reserve
Wow.
specifically for mangrove conservation, but also for the conservation of shorebirds, which are reliant on the mud flats that are adjacent to these mangroves. So yes, there's still populations of mangroves in Singapore. There's also mangroves in Pulau Ubin. That's probably one of my favorite offshore islands to visit on weekends and to monitor coastal habitats. And on Pulau Tekong, which is a military island, there is also still mangroves there. Actually, in fact, in Singapore, the military islands, I don't know if Mindef is going to be like, annoyed with me for explaining this, but the military islands are actually great for nature conservation because no
Hmm.
one's allowed in, right? So no one's allowed
Mm.
there. No one can go there to poach things because you'll probably get shot. So, so Tekong has quite a big, substantial population of mangroves as well as some of the offshore islands. I think there's one
Right.
around Pulau Pawai. There's actually quite like a smaller, but also very pristine mangrove habitat. And in the western catchment area, there is also a lot of mangroves there. So those areas that are under military watch are actually
Okay.
great places for nature to thrive.
Thanks to the Singapore Army,
Yes,
right?
thanks to the
Yes.
Singapore Army. Good job.
Doing your bit for the
Yes,
environment.
exactly.
Just say hi to Yet Me and as well also LinkedIn users. Hello everyone. Anyway,
Hello,
yeah.
yes, thanks for joining us. Right, so I mean, according to UNESCO, mangroves are actually disappearing much faster than overall global forest losses. Can you just explain why is that?
I think I haven't read that specific report, but off the top of my head, it's probably because of the human pressures in coastal areas. So if you think about it, I think something like I think 200 billion people, no, sorry, 2.4 billion people live within 100 meters of the coastline. Sorry, 100 kilometers of the coastline.
Right.
And of that, like in the coastal areas that are prone to flooding and all of this, there's another further 600 million people. So if you think of all the pressure of having that densely populated areas in these coastal areas, it tends to come with a lot of pressures. So things like
Mm-hmm.
pollution, things like runoff from land. In fact, something like 80% of all pollution in the sea and oceans actually comes from land-based sources. So if you think of all of those pressures, along with the fact that especially in Southeast Asia, there is also pressure from land use conversion. So mangroves, because they're in these sheltered coastal areas, they tend to be converted into aquaculture fish ponds for the use of aquaculture, which is not particularly sustainable in that format. So because of all of these pressures, that's why the rate of loss is so high. And if you think about in developed countries, like Singapore and other coastal cities, there's a lot of reclamation going on as well.
Mm,
And reclamation in one fell swoop, you can like remove 100 hectares of mangroves just in the blink of
wow.
an eye. So there's all of those pressures, which probably results in a faster rate of loss.
Right.
But that said,
Mm,
there are you know opportunities and trends to reverse this loss, especially in for areas that have been converted into fish ponds. If it's already been reclaimed, it's going to be rather difficult to turn it back into a
Mm.
mangrove area. But if it's been converted to other uses, for example, agriculture or fish ponds, there is still an opportunity to restore the mangroves so that they can continue doing, providing those ecosystem functions that are good for both humans as well as our climate.
Right. If you have any questions for Dr. Siti, okay, please feel free to ask them, and I'm sure she'll be able to address them. And also, hi to Cindy. Now, can you share some of the ways restoring mangroves will help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? Because I know everything has a ripple effect.
That's true. You're absolutely right. So I think the most obvious SDG it would be supporting is probably number 14, which is life below water.
Mhm.
So a healthy mangrove ecosystem actually is essential for the functioning of other coastal habitats, such as your seagrass and your mangroves. As I mentioned earlier, there are some species that actually spend part of their life cycle in mangroves, and without the mangroves, that life cycle those stages are disrupted. So these connections between the coastal systems are very important. So that goes for seagrass as well as
Yeah.
corals and
Right.
mangroves. Mangroves actually trap a lot of the sediments and nutrients that's coming out from rivers, and that prevents it from getting onto seagrasses and coral reefs, which improves water clarity, improves nutrient absorption, so that there's not so much what's the non-scientific term for eutrophication? There's not so much there's improvement in water clarity and water
Right.
quality on
Yeah.
coral reefs.
Thanks for putting it in
Um,
layman's terms.
yes, exactly. I'm just like, what is the term I need to use? But anyway, yeah. So that's SDG 14, life below water. There's also SDG 13, I think, which is halting biodiversity loss.
Right.
So mangroves are a hotspot for biodiversity. Actually, most tropical systems are, and conserving them or restoring them will help with SDG 13, SDG 15 as well, to which is actually life on land, but because the
Right.
mangroves kind of like bridge that interface between land and sea,
Mm.
you are actually fulfilling SDG 15, which is to reduce the degradation of natural habitats and prevent extinction of threatened species. But I think most importantly and sometimes overlooked is SDG 1 and 2,
Yeah.
which are eliminating poverty and
Yeah.
hunger. So, through the restoration of mangroves and sustainable resource use, coastal communities are actually able to harvest from these
Mm.
mangrove areas
Mm.
in a sustainable way that allows for the perpetuation of the mangrove, but also
Mm.
for them to have economic resources
Mm.
from the mangrove. So this includes things like sustainable use of they can use firewood from mangroves.
Right. Right.
A lot of like you said, a lot of food resources actually come from there, including atapchi, which is
Right.
something that we all love in our desserts.
Yes.
Um, very important, like you said, to hit
Yes.
the stomach of,
Yep.
of
That's what
Asians
we
in
love.
general.
What? Atapchi? Okay.
Yeah, and also of course the fisheries factor. So as I mentioned before, fisheries, marine protein is a very important source of protein for in lesser developed countries because it's easily accessible. But what was when I was speaking to my friend who studies these natural habitats as socio-ecological systems, meaning
Mm.
like understanding the human and nature relationship and
Interaction. Yeah.
interaction, is that that when in these coastal communities that are like more subsistence or small scale
Yeah.
artisanal fisheries, the men go out to sea to fish, but the
Right.
women actually collect from these coastal intertidal habitats, including mangroves and seagrass, and the what they collect from there is actually for subsistence, and that allows them to then sell the
Yeah.
more lucrative catch that
Right.
the men catch, like offshore, in the markets. So that actually allows them to be both self-sufficient through their
Mm.
gleaning activities, but also have a source of income through the sale of whatever they catch.
Right.
So it's actually really important, especially in the empowerment of women, because women are very much
Yes.
involved in like gleaning from these coastal habitats. So that's SDG 1 and 2, but also that's related to SDG 8, right? Economic livelihoods. So there's
Yeah.
diverse opportunities. So as I mentioned before, the fisheries activities. A lot of mangroves actually now incorporate silviculture, which is a
Mm.
form of sustainable harvesting or
Mm.
farming within mangrove habitats,
Mm.
which is really cool actually, because then you don't have to like tear them down to make these ponds, which then become obsolete or like
Mm.
come to like the end of their lives in like a couple of years.
Yeah.
um and also like things like firewood, and also the from restoring these habitats you actually provide opportunities for employment, for like monitoring and for planning of those
Right.
restoration activities. So
Right.
there's job creation in that as well.
So sustainable cities and communities, because
Exactly, yes.
because otherwise their livelihoods have been affected.
Correct.
Right. I'm just
Yeah.
looking at some comments here from Bob. I'm from Taiping, home of the oldest mangrove reserve.
Oh,
True or
that's
not?
true. Yes,
True.
yes.
Okay. Okay. Bob, you're
Well
not lying.
done. You know your local history. Good job.
Yeah, well, because he's from
Good
Taiping, so
job,
he should
Bob.
know. Cindy, so the I think we're talking about the SDGs. There's 17 SDGs. You can look through them; they all connect. And there is a question here, but I think think as you're talking, if it's not addressed, we'll get to that as well. What can we do to
Mhm.
bring awareness and education, the need of mangroves? So we have these things, these sessions, so you can learn about it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, over to
Yes.
you.
Yeah, so obviously, you shared a lot about how restoring mangroves is going to help us achieve the SDGs. But, how is data and science-based solutions at the DHI Group actually aiding with the conservation of mangrove ecosystems? And could you share like some of the challenges as well of
Sure.
actually restoring
I'm glad you asked.
them?
So, so at DHI, we're all about water environments. And although it's a company actually full of engineers, as a ecologist, my interest is in how to take those engineering solutions and apply them in an ecological setting. So one of the things that we've done for mangroves is actually this tool called agent-based modeling, where we look at the connectivity between mangrove habitats. So, as I mentioned before, Frida, like we used to have a lot more mangroves in Singapore, but now they're in like these disparate patches, right? And
HDBs.
yeah, but what the modeling does is understands the connectivity between those different patches, or those different populations, as we call them, and then we study what is the connectivity between them. So this is good for planning, because then you can identify which mangrove forests are actually sources of new propagules and new material, and which ones are good sinks. So which habitats are giving and which habitats are receiving, or which habitats are kind of doing both. And that particular modeling exercise was very interesting, because it showed that obviously there's a lot of connections with Malaysia, because across the causeway there are also mangrove forests. So the Singapore and the Malaysian mangroves are actually taking and giving from each other, which is nice.
We need
Um,
each other.
exactly,
Yes.
we need each other.
Bridging the
So
gap.
bridging the gap, indeed. And yeah, so that helps in planning. So when you are trying to assess, like, okay, so do we need to enhance this mangrove so that it can give more to the other populations nearby, or do we need to maybe rehabilitate a bit of this habitat, because this particular area is very good at receiving, and because it's good at receiving, there's a lot of natural recruitment, and that allows the forest to grow on its own.
Right. Right.
The other thing we do is actually use our modeling software to actually look at how currents and waves affect sedimentation and how sediment dynamics. So that's very important for mangroves, because they live in sedimentary environments. And what we can do is actually design a lot of coastal development in Singapore. We need to have nature, and we them so that we can maximize the natural recruitment. So I'll give you an example. There are areas around East Coast, which is full stretch of reclaimed land. And actually, Changi Airport, where Changi Airport is also previously, I
Right.
think it was previously both mangrove and seagrass, but it's now, reclaimed. So in those areas in East Coast, there has been a lot of active natural recruitment, and that's because we've built the coastline to encourage the settlement of mangroves and of seagrass into those areas. So when you do that, you actually don't have to do the restoration yourself, because nature will do it for you through the power of hydrodynamics. And all you have to do is design the coastline correctly so that it harnesses the maximum amount of recruitment that could be coming into that area. And you also provide habitat for them to establish themselves. And nature is extremely resilient. You will find that it will keep popping up here and there. Like, even if you're walking, on the streets, there's a crack in the pavement, there tends to be a plant
Yes.
just growing out of it. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's the same thing in the marine environment. So
Right.
it's just about building your coastlines with ecological engineering design in
Right.
mind, and that's something that DHI does as well. And the last thing we're doing is actually trying to, I guess, help use data and numerical approaches to help in the quantification of carbon. So as I mentioned before, mangroves and other blue carbon habitats such as seagrass and salt marshes in temperate regions are very effective coastal carbon sinks that help in mitigating climate change. And but the thing is, the methods are very manual. You have to go down there and like take a sediment sample and then measure it in the lab. So what we're trying to do is harness our numerical models to look at how water flow is actually encouraging deposition, and therefore, like, the amount of carbon coming into those systems and that can be stored in the sediments. So making these methods faster can actually help people better understand the environments, but also great for when you are trying to develop, say, carbon offset programs in blue carbon habitats, because then it reduces the amount of labor and time needed to get all of this data in place to get your
Right.
project certified.
Right. But then, obviously you've talked a lot about how, the carbon is stored within the mangroves. But if
Mhm.
these mangrove ecosystems are destroyed, they actually
Yes,
emit the carbon as well, which have been
that's
stored for
right.
hundreds and hundreds of years. So, I mean, can you just share, like, how much of a worry is this if they are destroyed along the way?
It's a huge worry, Ryan.
Yeah.
It keeps me up at night. No, I'm
Yes.
kidding. No, but sometimes it does. Um,
I mean, it is a worry for all of
it is.
us,
It
really.
is.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
So actually, that goes for all carbon systems, right? So not just mangroves, but also seagrasses and salt marshes. When they are modified or destroyed, what you're doing is, so in I mentioned earlier on in this conversation that in the sedimentary environment, so in the soil of the mangroves, is where 2/3 of the carbon stock is
Right.
in the whole ecosystem. And if you think about the removal of mangroves and therefore the reintroduction of that 2/3 of all that carbon, it goes back into the water, and through that it enters the carbon cycle again. So
And it's
already as it
essentially a
is.
greenhouse gas, right?
Exactly. Yes. So then
Oh.
it's reworked eventually into the atmosphere and into, like,
Mm.
other oceanic global carbon cycles and things like that. So it's actually putting a pressure. So we're already having a lot of pressure because of all this excess CO2 in the atmosphere. Now we're also emitting it from the sea. That's just a recipe for a climate disaster.
Mm.
Mm.
So yes, it is a big worry. So I think, one of the things that we need to take into consideration, especially in developments in coastal habitats, is to understand what is the consequence of this loss of these mangroves, right? Not just for what carbon is being reintroduced into the global carbon cycle, or the systems, but also, like, what is the loss in capacity for future carbon sequestration, because
Yeah.
these habitats have been working quietly for, like,
Right.
millennia to absorb all of this carbon, and all of this ancient carbon is being reintroduced. So, like, and then on top of that, you're losing another carbon sink. So it's
Yeah.
it's really problematic. So, in those situations, if you know that you are going to be emitting all of this, you should find mitigation measures or ways in which to prevent as much of that carbon from being reintroduced to the environment as possible.
Right. So,
Mm.
how are nature-based solutions helping to build the resilience of coasts in Singapore and around the region, which face the threat of rising sea levels? I mean, there's nature, and then I guess we have to come in and help nature in the process.
Yes. Yes. So nature-based solutions, as the name implies, is solutions that use nature to for the benefit of both the environment as well as human and our livelihoods, right? So how can we get a win-win situation from, I guess, these sorts of the implementation of nature-based solutions. So it's true that mangroves can help somewhat with sea level rise, but it really depends on the rate of sea level rise and whether there is space behind the mangroves for the mangroves to retreat into. So
Hmm.
if you have this thing called coastal squeeze, where you have development behind the mangrove, like say you have built, like, factories behind this mangrove forest,
Mm.
that's not going to help with sea level rise, because yes, there is some absorption in the mangrove habitats, because obviously it's a natural habitat, so you won't get flooding there. But what could happen is the mangroves cannot then retreat into the space behind it. So the thing about
Mm,
these sorts of nature-based solutions to deal or grapple with sea level rise is to have enough space for the habitats to do their thing, you know.
right.
If
You're
you
in my
don't give them
space.
space, yeah,
Yeah,
they
give
need
it
their
the
space,
space, right?
exactly. Yes. But that is kind of so when we talk about nature-based solutions, there are adaptation solutions. So how can we use nature to adapt to climate challenges? So sea level rise is one of them. Obviously, if you have less hard infrastructure, then you have things like less runoff, and then you have less flooding. But the other equation is the other side of the coin is of course mitigation. So how much can we absorb so that we prevent these scenarios from happening too soon. I
Right.
don't know. I feel like the UN has said several times that we're at the point of we're almost at the
Mm,
point of no return. If we don't stay below 1.5 degrees by 2030, we'll be in big trouble. And nature-based solutions, especially nature-based carbon mitigation solutions, can actually provide up to a third of the cost-effective and near-term measures for us to stay below 1.5. But that means that we cannot destroy any more of these
right.
forests, including like land
Mm.
forests, right? So both terrestrial and mangrove and blue carbon habitats. Um, but also we need to start looking at how we can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we're currently emitting. So that's through things like implementing more sustainable or green or renewable energy sources,
Mm,
but also looking at how we can offset these carbon emissions. So nature-based carbon offsets are also a solution. So there are many ways we can go about doing this, but really the biggest thing is that we need to switch to renewables so that we stop burning fossil fuels in order to
Yeah.
live the way we do. Actually, I was at a climate conference in Brunei last week, and everyone was talking about, oh, how can we reduce our personal carbon footprint. And quite honestly, I think it's a bit disingenuous for all these large
yeah.
energy companies to tell you to reduce your carbon footprint,
Right.
when
Mm.
really if everyone just switched to a renewable energy source, we wouldn't have to worry about that, right? so
Right.
so someone was giving like young people grief about scrolling TikTok all day. They're like, oh, do you know how much carbon you're emitting by scrolling TikTok all day? And I
Oh,
said,
just
well,
blame Gen Z for everything.
exactly. I was like, well, it's not their fault. I mean, your if your country refuses to switch to a, cleaner,
EV, right?
yeah,
Electric vehicles or
exactly.
what
If
have
your
you,
country
right?
refuses to, if the big changes don't happen, how do you expect this like 13-year-old kid
Mm.
to
Yeah.
have like a
Mm,
tangible effect, right?
mm,
So yes, I think like this whole thing about a personal carbon footprint is important, obviously,
yeah.
because we need to
Yeah.
reduce our impact on the environment in general. But
Right.
there is only so much you can do, right? The real
Mm,
change happens, like, at the policy level,
right.
at, the whole country scale. So, giving an example, one of the biggest energy providers in Denmark, Ørsted, has actually completely divested from fossil fuels. It's now completely all renewable, which means that you can scroll TikTok all day and you're not going to have an effect, which is great.
Wow.
Like,
Yes.
so I
Whew.
think we need to think about this at like, this the
Yes.
like a bigger scale, like
Yes.
it's not just about like, your own carbon footprint, right?
Yes.
It's about like how are you getting your energy sources, and I think Singapore is doing quite a bit to help with that. So we are, there's a lot of solar panels being
Right.
deployed, but I think there's still a lot more we can do, including like you mentioned EVs.
Mm, mm. So,
Like I think every HDB should have an EV charging station, but where's
right.
mine?
So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think they
things
are.
need.
They're working on it for sure.
I
And
Yeah,
think they're
yeah,
even
working
like
on it, right?
yes,
the
yeah,
floating solar panels, like you mentioned,
exactly. Yeah,
it's still a long way to go, but we're
yes,
still, at least baby steps are,
And things
progressing.
have to
for
change
sure.
on the macro perspective before it, I mean, of course we all
Yes.
do our bit, but things have to change, right? And just a comment here, it says seagrasses also under severe threat as a consequence of the degradation of mangroves, and the dugong population has dwindled significantly.
It's
Yes.
true. I don't know who this LinkedIn user is, but you're absolutely right.
Absolutely.
So this harks back to what I was saying earlier about how all these coastal marine systems are actually connected, right? So you destroy one, it actually has knock-on effects for all the other habitats. So this is a very good example of
Mhm.
how the degradation of mangroves actually, like resuspends all the sediment, reintroduces all this carbon, and that affects the seagrass meadows because then it settles in the seagrass meadows, and
Mm.
there's a lot of sedimentation, and the seagrasses get smothered because they're not as large as mangroves; they're a lot smaller. And if they get smothered, then they die, and then there's no food for the dugongs, which then starve, and
Yeah, gosh.
you don't want to kill a dugong. So
No,
save our
absolutely
coastal
not.
systems.
Safe, yes, absolutely. Well,
Yes.
thank you so much to you, Dr. Siti Maryam Yaakub, Head of Projects, Nature-Based and Climate Solutions at DHI Group. It's honestly been a real pleasure speaking with you.
And of course,
Thank you for having me. Sorry,
and
go on.
if anybody has any other questions, I mean, I'm sure we'll you just put them on, and then people watching this later, and we'll be in touch with Dr. Siti as well. So thank you so much again, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope this has been very educational. It's very
Absolutely.
enlightening. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. So I'm Freda Liu.
I'm Rianne Lovell-Boland, and this has been Causeway Conversations, Bridging the Sustainability Gap. Please do watch out. We're going to be having another conversation next month in August, so do watch out for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.